Hello everyone and welcome to Tech with Robert, the Get Started with T-SQL course. In this course we're going to talk about the aggregate functions, and we're going to take a look at the sum function here, how we can summarize data and sum data across different groups. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, give a thumbs up on the video if you like what I do. That really helps me to know what I do well and what you guys want me to improve on or focus more on in the future lectures. So without further ado, let's dive right into T-SQL. So up until now, we've mainly queried data, we've sorted data. We looked at how we can work with strings, date and date times, and numeric data, and just how we can, order, sort our results, and mainly just retrieve data. But now we want to take a look at how we can actually start to examine and start to analyze the data, because sure, it's very important to know how to query the data, take a look at it, but we also need to know how we can turn it around and aggregate it and need to sort of just analyze it. And so if we take an example here, if we just write here, we say we want to select the order date and the sales amount from the fact internet sales table. Okay, so watch what happens here. We see that we get each order date, the day, and we get the corresponding sales amount value here. And so what this is doing, it's taking each row that we have in our sales table. Let me just say, if we could, for example, we could add the sales order number here, for example. And so we say this sales order number here, and that was on this date, and we sold for that much amount. And so what if we wanted to know that how much is the total sales? So for all of these 60,400 rows, what is the total sales amount? If we just take all of these values here and add them together, what number is that? And so what we could do is we could say we want to select the sum of the sales amount. Okay, and we need to give it an alias because otherwise it's not going to have a column name. So we could say sales amount, sum of the sales amount as total sales. All right, and then from fact internet sales. So if we run this query here, or actually we can run both of them at the same time. So if we run this query here, we see that this number here, this is all of these values here. So all of the 60,000 rows here approximately, all of these values are added together, and then it results in this number here, the total sales here. But as we can see here we don't have any context to that number. We're just simply saying give us the sum of everything. So just take everything, just summarize it, and give us the sum of all of these cells, right? And so what happened if we wanted to see, because we see here that okay, we have the 29th of December we sold for this one, but we also sold on the same day, we sold for that amount as well, and then here we also, it's the same date, and so on. So we have all of these rows here, these 5 first rows, all of these sales occurred on the same date. And so I would say, okay, so how much did we actually sell for on the 29th of December? So we could say, okay, it's 3,578 plus 3,300, that's 6,900. So you see my point here is that what if we just wanted to display that? So we see for each date that was an occurring sale, we want to see for each date how much was the total sales for each day. So what we could do is we could simply just say we want the order date here. But notice what's going to happen if we just run this query like this. It's going to say that the order date is invalid in the select list because it's not contained in either an aggregate function or the group by clause. And this specific error message is something that a lot of new SQL programmers run into often, and so I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain it. It says here that the order date is invalid in the select list, and the select list is this one here, everything that is between the select and the from statements here. So it says that the order date is invalid in the select list because it's not contained in either an aggregate function or the group by clause. And so what it means here, that it's not contained in an aggregate function. If we look at this, why didn't it say that for the sales amount. Why did it say that specifically for the order date and not the sales amount? Because what we see here, the sales amount column that we're also using in combination with the order date, the sales amount column is contained inside an aggregate function. So we have typed this inside of the sum function here, and sum is an aggregate function. So notice what it said, either an aggregate function or the group by clause. So we could say, for example, although this would not make any sense at all, we could say that we say the sum of the order date as well, and we run this. Okay, now it's a daytime, but just to prove my point here, we see that now the order date is inside an aggregate function. And so now we get a different error. We don't get the error that we got before. And this is because, so what we need to do if we want to run this query, it says either an aggregate function or the group by clause. And so since we don't want to perform any aggregates and the calculations on the order date, we want to do it only on the sales amount column. We're not going to contain it in an aggregate function, so we need to do it in a group by clause. And so what we must do is we must type group by. So what do we want to group by? We want the total sales, and we want that big number, we want to divide it into different order dates. So we wanted to group it by the order date. And if you're unsure what you want to group by, you can see here that everything that is in the select list here, you must use it in a group by here if you are using an aggregate function. So in this case, we will say we want to group it by the order date. And so now what happens is, we can say, and we want to order it by order date. So now we see in this, if we run both of them at the same time here, you see here that in the first query, we saw that we had 5 transactions here that occurred on the 29th of December, but now the 29th of December is only displayed once here, and it's taken all of these rows here, all of these sales, and it added them up together, so summarize them and say the total sales here. So what this means is that this number here is the total sales amount that occurred on this date. No matter how many transactions there were, they could have been 1 or they could have been 100 transactions. We still just, since we specified that we want to group it by order date, we're going to get every value, only one time, so the distinct value and then the aggregate function here, and group it by that order date. And so what would happen if we added something else? For example, we say we want the, let me see here, we do it like this, we say, we also want the revision number, for example. Notice what's going to happen if we run this. So we see now we have order date, revision number, and the sum of the sales amount, and we have grouped it by the order date and also ordered it by the order date. So what happens if we run this? So this is my point here. This is why I said that a lot of people in the beginning, they usually run into this, and this is one of the most common error messages that you will run into in the beginning. And so here is that, okay, revision number is invalid in the select list because it does not contain either an aggregate function or the group by clause. And by now you should understand what that means. So you say, okay, order revision number is not contained in, for example, a sum here, an aggregate function, or the group by clause. And since we have this one, since we now have this one in our select list, we need to use it. We need to also use it in the group by. So we need to add it here and also group by the revision number. So now when we run this number, now we only had one revision number for that date, but if we had, let's say that this date was also the 29th of December and it was the number 2 here, they would have split it. So let's say 50% of this sales amount here was from the revision number 2 on the same date. Then you would have 50% of the sales here and the other 50% down here, because we're creating a group by, so we're grouping by, so we get the unique value for order date and the unique combinations for the revision number, and then the aggregate total sales for both of these. So this is how you work with the sum aggregate function. It's very important to know how to work with them and to understand that whenever you select your columns here in the select list, you need to either have that field inside of an aggregate function or use it in the group by clause. Otherwise, you will run into this error that we saw here. And this is a very commonly, it's an error that occurs a lot. So now hopefully you understand what it means and you know where to look and how to think when you're solving this problem here. So in the next lecture, we're going to continue with aggregate functions, but we're going to take a look at the count function. So I will see you guys in the next lecture.